Yom Tov, everyone. A good day to you. I don't know whether you're watching this in the morning, afternoon, or evening, so I'm going to just say Yom Tov. This is my attempt to compensate for the fact that we had to cancel our face-to-face Torah study over the summer. It torments me that I'm leaving you without Torah while I'm on vacation. So I decided I was just going to create a couple of online lessons. It won't be interactive the way I prefer it, the way Jewish tradition prefers it, what is known as the Hevruta system, the system of partners discussing and analyzing and coming to conclusions together, which is the ideal Jewish way to study. Instead, it's going to be me talking to you. But I hope these short little presentations will be interesting. I'm calling them Minutes of Midrash, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be focusing on the Jewish Bible interpretation system known as Midrash. Now, Midrash covers two ideas. First of all, Midrash is a style of interpretation. And secondly, Midrash is a genre, that is a collection of religious writings. So let's do the second one first, and then we'll do the first one, and that will lead into our text. All right. So the genre of Midrash is proven to be one of the most durable forms of Jewish interpretation. Its heyday, the period in which most Midrashim were produced, is the period from about the 1st century, about the same time as Jesus, until the last classical Midrashim are collected probably around the 10th, 11th century. These genre of books all concentrate on a single book of the Bible. So there'll be a Midrash for Genesis and a Midrash for Exodus, etc., etc. And then there'll be another Midrash for Genesis and another Midrash for Exodus. Each one has different names. And so, for example, there is a popular collection of all 5 books of the Bible analyzed in the Midrashic style called Midrash Rabbah, the great Midrash. But there's also Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, which I'll be teaching you from, which is just about the book of Exodus. There's Kohelet Rabbah, which is devoted to the book of Ecclesiastes, and on it goes. Now, saying that these books focus on a single biblical book should not mislead us into thinking that these are comprehensive interpretations. Which brings us to number 1, the style of Midrash. So we today are used to what I would call contextual reading of the Bible. We'll read an entire section, a narrative, a set of laws together, and we'll interpret what the author is trying to say to us, what the biblical author is trying to say to us in its context. The story of the spies, what are we supposed to learn from that? The story of Abraham and his almost sacrifice of his son, the Akedah, what are we supposed to derive from that? The Hebrew word for this kind of study is peshat, which means the obvious meaning, the standard meaning, that sort of thing. But that style only came into existence around the 12th and 13th century. And while we're most familiar with that, the Midrash takes an entirely different approach to it. So Midrash as style does exactly the opposite. It actually, we might find this disturbing, but it's kind of fun, decontextualizes sections of the Bible one from the other and analyzes minute features, what I would call the atomized text. So in Midrash, instead of reading the entire 1st chapter of Genesis, it might focus on a single verse, like Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So in the beginning, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth was chaos and void. That's all they want to pay attention to. and they're going to separate it out from the rest of the narrative, and they're going to concentrate on that verse and tease out ideas from that verse. But that's not the stop of it. Midrash actually will maybe take a single word out of that verse, like Breshit, and they'll produce a whole bunch of interpretive analysis on that. But it doesn't stop at that. Sometimes the Midrash will devote an entire section to studying a single letter in a single word, in a single verse. So instead of concentrating on Genesis 1:1, instead of concentrating on Breshit, it concentrates on the bet, the first letter of Breshit, and will produce a remarkable number of interpretations. It's wild, it's crazy, it's ridiculous. Why should we assume that a verse in isolation contains significant meaning, or a word, or, heaven forfend, a single letter? What does a single letter have to teach us? Well, the assumption of the midrashist, the person who does this kind of interpretation, is that the Bible contains everything. It's all there. And if it isn't there in the narrative, or it isn't there in the laws, the answer to all of our questions may appear and be explained by a single verse, might be explained by a word, might even be explained by a letter. And so the Midrash digs into this and discovers these meanings. Now, in some cases, we would look at these and say they impose meaning, but that's okay. It's actually Bible as jazz, right? Contextual reading is a symphony where we follow a certain path created for us by the composer, and it leads us to a culmination or an anthem or some fundamental idea. The Midrashist believes that the Bible is jazz, and even a single bar, a single note, is a hook on which one can build an entire understanding. Now, this is pretty radical for us, but it is an incredible exercise in imagination, and it serves a couple of very important purposes, the chief of which is that if and when we as a human society, as a Jewish society, reach a point where our understanding changes, which it does, knowledge progresses, the way we think changes, and we go to our Tanakh, our Bible, our Torah, and we assume by tradition that it contains the answers to everything, but it doesn't seem to. When we read it, it's a very ancient document from a very different time period. The Midrash allows us to discover more contemporary meaning. It allows us to draw out lessons we need for the world in which we live. So it is one of the chief ways that this very, very ancient document, or library of documents, the Hebrew Bible, remains relevant to us. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to take you into a relatively late product of the Midrashic tradition, but one that I spent a great deal of time studying when I was at Hebrew Union College. It's called Midrash Tanhuma, and it's produced relatively late in the period of Midrashic composition, the early Middle Ages. And so in many ways, it's actually reiterating and building on pre-existing Midrashim. So originality is not its major feature, but what it does is it continues to adapt earlier Midrashim written during the Greco-Roman period when they were dealing with the Greco-Roman reality, and in some ways intellectually updates it to the Middle Ages, but only to a limited point. The sages really did believe that the Bible is an eternal document, and therefore it holds eternal truths. And if we discover something new which is relevant to our time, the fact of the matter is, according to the sages, that information was always there. It was waiting for us to discover it. It's not that we impose it on the text, but the text finally is ready to reveal itself. So in a moment, we're going to do Midrash Tanhuma here. I'm going to pause. So this is my trusty set of Midrash Tanhuma, which has been with me since Israel and rabbinical school. It is actually all 5 books of the Torah with interpretations. And but even this is a little deceptive, because in truth there are 3 different versions of Midrash Tanhuma. You can say, how is that possible? It's because it existed for centuries in manuscript. So what was happening was that there were commentators and scribes who were working on a copy of Midrash Tanhuma and thought to themselves, oh, it needs to have a couple more interpretations that aren't here, or that interpretation has fallen out of date. It's not interesting to me anymore, so I'm going to replace it or discard it. So there's actually 3 different versions of this before the printing press was invented. But this is the primary one that most people are familiar with. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call up the page that I've reproduced for you, and we're going to walk our way through it, and you get a feel for it. All right, here we go. All right, so there it is, Midrash Tanhuma, and this is Breshit, the first chapter of the first book, and it's going to concentrate entirely on the first verse. Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Now, you would think that this will go on for a little ways. In fact, most of the first chapter is devoted to this first verse. Midrash Tanhuma piles up one interpretation after another. 8 or more chapters entirely focused on interpreting this one opening verse. And you'll see very quickly they're going to reduce it even further. So let me show you how they do it. And what's going to be happening here is that the Midrash is going to cite the original verse, and then it's going to pull in other verses, and it's going to make a claim, and it's going to use those other verses to proof text its claim, and then it's going to keep going. All right, so let's start right here with the beginning. All right, now right there, we already have got something. The Midrash is onto something that we're not so aware of. If you're familiar with the King James version of Genesis, it's in the beginning. That is, it understands the first letter of Breshit, ba, to be a preposition, in, or with, or at, or on, or in. But in fact, the Midrashist has already noticed that that's not the linguistic form here. Reshit is not a noun. Reshit is a infinitive. So it's referring to ongoing action. So in a very, very subtle move that we might miss, it recognizes that the proper way to translate this is with the beginning, which is a terrible way to start a sentence in English. With the beginning of what? And they're going to answer that question. So this is what Scripture means when it says, citing another verse, the Lord with wisdom founded the earth. All right, so it's hooking the ba in Breshit to the ba in wisdom in the Proverbs, right? So now, because it says ba in one place and it says the same ba in another place, now beginning and wisdom belong together. They are synonymous, all right? And the verse sounds very good. The Lord with wisdom founded the earth. So what did God, with the beginning, God used wisdom. That's the message. It's built into the first letter, something that we wouldn't be able to derive from the Peshat, the plain meaning of the text. But the rabbis insist this is what it really means. That is, when the Holy One, blessed be He, or as I like to translate it, the Blessed Holy One, was about to create this world, He consulted the Torah before embarking on the work of creation. As it is said, counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding. Power is mine. All right, now we have to realize what they're doing here, right? So again, what's connecting these verses is wisdom. And who is the I? Who is speaking in this verse? Well, if you actually look at Proverbs, you'll see that frequently wisdom is personified and wisdom speaks. And so the I, the first person in this, is wisdom. And we've already learned that wisdom is used at the beginning of creating the world. And what is that wisdom? It's Torah. So the Torah is, in effect, according to this interpretation, the blueprint which God consulted in order to create the universe. So the Torah becomes not only the wellspring of wisdom in the way we would think of it, but it becomes a metaphysical wisdom, and it's a metaphysical object. Before God created anything else, He created Torah, but it doesn't even say that. It just says that Torah coexists with God, and God used it in order to construct His world. Wow. Okay, so the Torah is a deeply cosmic object that we need to respect and analyze. And of course, if it's rooted in the cosmos, then a simple B at the beginning of Bereshit could be something of profound significance. So this message informs itself, right? It teaches us, how do you know that the bet means something this transcendent? Well, because the proof text suggests that that's the nature of the text itself. It's a little circular in its reasoning, but it's a lot of fun. All right. How was the Torah written? So how did God compose this object that we know as a bunch of polished animal skins written with ink by human beings? How cosmic was it? It was written with letters of black fire on a surface of white fire. Now, fire and light, of course, have always represented the supernal, the heavenly, the celestial, the sun, the moon, the stars. So the Torah in its original form was this celestial entity, like the stars. How are they going to prove that? As it's said, now they're going to give us another proof text, but this one's from an entirely different source. It's from the Song of Songs. Pause. If you think of the Song of Songs, what do you think of? Well, you think of love songs, the songs of Solomon, canticles, Song of Songs. It's about a lusty guy and a lusty woman coming together in love. But a pre-existing interpretation from the rabbinic tradition is that what the Song of Songs is really about is God's love for Israel and Israel's love for God. It's a giant allegory. And in fact, you make a mistake to read it literally. So when it says, his locks are curled and black as a raven, whose locks? Well, in its original context, in chapter 5, it's a poem describing the male lover. It begins at the top of his head, describes his beautiful Antonio Banderas-like curly black hair, and then it proceeds down his body, describing all of his features in extravagant metaphors and comparisons. All right, so, but if the allegory is God is the lover of Israel, Israel is the lover of God, what happens is that Israel tends to be identified as the male lover. God is identified as the male lover. Israel is identified by the female lover. So his locks are curled and black as ravens, must be referring to God, right? God has Antonio Banderas hair. Ridiculous. We know from other sources in Judaism that God is not shaped like a human being. God doesn't have human features. So what the heck is going on by saying that God has curly black hair that's as dark as a raven? It's an allegory, right? It means something else. It refers to something else. And that's what the Midrash goes on to tell you. What is God's curly hair? What is meant by his locks are curled? It means that each crowned stroke on the letters of the Torah contains heaps and heaps of law. What? All right. So what are they referring to? Let's make a little change here. We're going to go back to our stop share. You're going to see my smiling face for just a moment. And we're going to figure out what God's curls look like. Ready? There. All right. This is the orthographic form, what we today would call the font, by which we write every Torah scroll. You recognize the alphabet, but you notice that there are these things. They're called atorot, or diadems, or crowns. In English, they're sometimes called finials. They are these little decorative sprouts that come out the top of the letters. It's only used when writing a Torah scroll, all right? So it's no doubt originally invented as an aesthetic addition to make the letters more attractive and interesting. But what is the Midrash saying these things are? These things are God's curls. These things are God's locks. The Torah is literally God's head. Well, not literally, metaphorically. I mean, it's metaphorically. It can't be literal because already we've determined it's not literal. But in any case, there it is. There are the locks and curls on God's head. And what it means is that the Torah itself, dare I use the phrase, embodies God. It is the primary way that God becomes manifest in our world. And when we look at the beauty of Torah and its messages, we see God. Mind blown, right? And when it says these are piles, heaps upon heaps of laws, what it's saying is that if you know enough about Torah, you can look at each of these finials, each of these crowns, and you can derive lessons from them. That's how deep the Midrash goes into the question of interpreting the Torah, right? So if I see a bet with one finial on it, and I see a bet elsewhere without a finial, there's some message there for me. I just am not smart enough to decode it yet. So there are secrets within secrets, messages within messages, layered within the Torah, if we're just smart enough to discover them. And that's what the Midrash does. It tries to get inside of all these ideas and reveal these secrets. And already we've discovered that the very first word holds secrets with the use of the bet as a preposition, serving as a with for the infinitive rather than a preposition for the noun. And already secrets have been revealed, and on it goes. So the rabbis are in love with the Torah because they're in love with God. And Torah represents the closest thing that brings them to the object of their desire. So it's really pretty powerful stuff. So let's go back and revisit our text and continue. All right, going back to share. There we are. Okay, so how is the Torah written? It was written with letters of black fire and a surface of white fire. So already it is a celestial thing. As it is said, his locks are curled and black as raven. So the black is built into the surface of the black supernal thing, which is God's hair, which represents actually the secrets contained within the Torah, right? It means that every crown stroke, every atorah, every finial on the letters of the Torah contains heaps and heaps of law. With me so far? Okay. For example, it is written in the Torah, profane not my holy name. Now, what they're going to focus on is, again, a single letter, all right? The word profane begins with a chet. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew alphabet know what a chet looks like. It looks like a kind of standing bridge, all right? Or I'll show you one in a minute, all right? But if you should just, in a minor way, alter that letter and produce a virtually identical letter, which is the hey, the word would read praise. And then the sentence would read, praise not my holy name, which is a very bad message. All right. So what they're saying is even the gap or the absence of a gap in a shape of the letters is enough to alter the entire Torah and its meaning. And then it goes on to say, but if you should change the het in the world, yechalelu, profane, into a hey, the word would read praise, and you would thereby destroy the world. In other words, you would subvert the meaning of Torah, and we would say that one should not praise God, and that undermines the very essence of the world. Conversely, where it is written, let everything that has breath praise the Lord, there the word praise, halal, begins with a hey. What happens if you connect the hey and create a het with just a little extra ink? If you should alter the hey to the word techalel or tihalel into a het, then it becomes techalel, which means to profane. So let everything that has breath profane the Lord. Right? The hair that I don't have that God has is now coming out, and you would thereby destroy the world. So even a minor alteration in the shape of the letters is destructive because they represent something so profound. We need to preserve it exactly. Now, let's go back and let me show you again the letters so that for those of you who are not so conversant in Hebrew, you can see the difference. All right, so here we go. We're going to share back to our letters. All right, so the first column, if you go over to the fifth letter from the right, that's a hey. And the hey looks just like the letter next to it, but it's got a little extra platform underneath it. But they're not connected. On the other hand, the het go 3 more letters over to the left, it's the second letter from the left, is connected across. So as a result, if you were to make a minor alteration in these letters, when you're writing out the Torah, praise would become profane, profane would become praise, and you would undermine, you'd create an opposite world, right? Where the completely wrong message is created. So every aspect, every word in the Torah contains potent meaning that we must understand. And this is how Midrash works. Midrash really believes that one enters into the most sacred possibilities when one reads the Torah. And it's actually kind of beautiful. I like to say that if in Christianity God is incarnate, God appears in the form of a human being in Jesus of Nazareth, in Judaism, God is inscribed. God is the product of our experience of God. I should say our experience of God is a product of encountering the divine word. That is God embodied metaphorically, allegorically, via simile, And it is our primary access to the God of Israel, the God who is the creator of the world. And that's the lesson of this first piece of Midrash. That's more than enough. I was going to go much further, but dissecting each and every part of this takes a lot of effort. And unfortunately, too often when we read Midrashim in English, we miss out on the wordplay, the puns, the clever philology, the clever linguistic analysis going on. This is an incredibly attentive way of reading the Torah, and it's beautiful. And I hope you are intrigued enough that you'll go on and look at other midrashim with me as we go forward, and I'll teach you some of the other techniques that the midrash uses. But the essence of this lesson is that the world is full of wisdom, that wisdom is in the Torah, that Torah is an object that pre-exists everything about us, and that there is no aspect of Torah that is irrelevant, that everything going on in Torah, from the biggest story or law to the smallest jot of a pen, has something to teach us. That's our first lesson in Midrash. Thank you all, and I look forward to speaking at you next week.